HowtExchange. For those of you who were going to ask that question, this will be posted on HowtExchange after the call. Great. Welcome, everybody, to our second point-in-time count office hours. I'm going to go ahead and kick things off right now by giving you an overview of what to expect today. We're going to start with some brief introductions of who we have on the line, and then I'm going to give you an overview of how to use this WebEx interface. After that, William is going to walk you guys through the changes to the 2019 HIC and PIT data collection notice. And then we'll pause after that, after his overview, to take a few questions on the data collection changes or just on the notice in general. Then we're going to move to our topic of focus for this session, which is going to center on how you guys recruit and train any volunteers who help out with your PIT count. And finally, we're going to open up the floor for the last half hour or so for an open Q&A session on anything that you want to bring to the table related to the PIT or HIC. So moving into this first section, let's go ahead and do some introductions. We have William Snow on the line from HUD's Office of Special Needs Assistance Programs, and then Megan Henry and I are both here from APT. Megan is the director of the annual homeless assessment report that goes to Congress each year, which many of you know as the AHAR, and her role includes overseeing the activities that are related to the PIT count and HIC data collection, analysis, and reporting. And I'm Aubrey Sittler, and I lead the development of tools and products to support PIT count data collection, and then I also am part of the PIT, HIC, and AHAR data collection and cleaning teams. So you'll hear from William in just a few minutes, but first I'd like to hit on a few housekeeping notes related to how to work the WebEx. For those of you who are on the first office hours call, you know that this interface looks pretty different from some of the other webinars that we host. And that's partly because we really want to hear your voices and get some attendee participation throughout the session. So right now I'm going to explain how some of those features work on the WebEx, and I'll tell you how we're hoping to use them to make that participation possible. So the image on your screen right now should be pretty close to what you see by default upon joining the call. And if you're having trouble connecting to the audio, you can go to the Quick Start tab in the upper left-hand corner, click on that audio conference icon, and then use your computer or phone to start. Yes, I recognize the irony of saying this out loud if somebody's having technical difficulties in connecting. Hopefully they'll see this slide and be able to do so. Note that in the upper right-hand corner of the WebEx screen, there are three icons that should be labeled Participants, Chat, and Q&A. Clicking on those icons turns on the panels of the same name. So when the icon is blue, it means that that panel is on, and it should be displayed below. And when we start asking polling questions later, there's a chance that you're going to have to click this little arrow to the right to see the polling panel. But we'll get to that in a bit. You can expand or collapse any of those panels using these little triangles on the left-hand side. If you want to have a bigger view on the Q&A or on the chat or anything like that, you can use that feature to do that. If you are having any technical difficulties throughout this call, you can go ahead and open that chat panel and then select Host or Aubrey Sittler to send a chat to, and I can go ahead and help you address any of the issues that you face, whether you can't hear or you can't see the presentation. Can help you troubleshoot all of those. And so as I mentioned before, we really do want today's call to be interactive. We want to hear your voices, and we want to know what questions you guys have about the PIT and the HIC. So if you expand that Participants tab up here, you'll see that there's a little hand icon. When it gets to the Q&A portions of the call, go ahead and push that button to raise your hand, and we'll know to unmute you. And we'll kind of explain how that goes in real time as it's happening. But you can use that button to both raise your hand and to unraise it in case somebody asks the question that you were planning to ask. If you have questions but your line doesn't seem to be linked to your call-in user, then go ahead and submit written questions through the Q&A box. So the chat is for more technical stuff, or if you want to send a message to everybody, you can do that too. But if you have specific questions you want us to answer, go ahead and use the Q&A box. And then one final note, if you do not see a phone next to your name under attendees, then that means that your phone isn't linked to your name in the WebEx, so I won't be able to unmute you. And if that's the case, like I said, just use the Q&A panel to write in any questions you have instead of using that hand-raising feature. Whenever it comes time for Q&As during the call, you're going to see a screen that looks like this. It's kind of a little cheat sheet of how to use all of these features. So hopefully that's helpful to you when we get there. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to William Snow from HUD to walk us through the 2019 Pitt and Hick data collection notice. William?
All right. Thank you very much. Very excited for today's call. Very excited that we finally got the notice out so we can kind of talk through things. You'll see, well, let's quickly actually jump into the changes. Let's start, though, with a poll. I'm curious how many of you have already read the 2019 Hick and Pitt notice, at least like the changes, even if you haven't read the whole thing. So let's put that poll up.
Pulling the poll up. You should see it now.
And I will say we're going to try to do, you'll see later in the training, we're going to focus a lot of the training content that we want to discuss through the polls, actually. So we'll use the polls pretty heavily in today's discussion, mainly because I like to hear from you guys, because you guys are really the experts, and that's great to hear from you. So.
Great.
All right.
So if you haven't answered, you've got maybe 5 more seconds. Got 59 non-answers. All right. Closing right now.
All right, I see it closed. Are we going to see?
It processes in about 5 more seconds.
Right. Again, just want to get a feel for who's had a chance to see what's coming. Important for us to get that understanding. So it looks, strangely, almost half are yes and half are no, with few not sure, no answers. So that's good. So people are familiar. You'll notice as I go along that this will be pretty heavy discussion around the Hick, and that's good. We're hoping not to make any changes next year. We've said that often. You'll see this year we did get a little closer to that, but our intent is to keep this. It actually is a standing notice. We've called it the 2019 notice, but actually it's a standing notice, and it's updated for the 19 count. If all goes well, you'll refer to this again next year. So we'll see if that happens. You can hold me to that, and we'll find out. So let's go to the first slide then, or the next slide. So a few changes. Not surprisingly, we now have some joint TH and RH projects, and we needed to figure out a way to report them in the Hick. So here's how they're going to be reported. You will report both of them separate, so both segments separate. You'll report the TH or transitional housing portion separate from the rapid rehousing portion of the project. So there'll be 2 separate projects for each joint TH and RH project. In the funding sources that are selected, the recipient or the COC in this case will select both TH or McKinney-Vento funded TH and McKinney-Vento funded RRH so that we get a feel for which one are the joint component grants. Consistent with other guidance, the transitional housing piece will be included also in your sheltered PIT count, so any persons in that project at the time will be counted as sheltered, and then those in the rapid rehousing will not be included in your point-in-time count. You'll still do the portion of the Hick that asks for the PIT count on the night of, so we get a sense of how the inventory is being used, but again, not included in your larger point-in-time count submission, your sheltered data. Okay. I will say if there's any change that happens next year, it may be around this, the joint TH. If there's any changes to the data standards around it, we want to be consistent with that. That actually is the only thing I foresee is possibly changing next year. So that's a possibility, though. All right, inventory type. Historically, we had current, new, and under development. What we were finding is we really didn't need the new. We really just needed to know what was functioning and what wasn't. So, and we've heard from a lot of communities that that can be frustrating to have the different designations. It really, like most people think of it as what's happening now and what's not happening now, but will happen. So we just changed the inventory types to reflect that. We now only have current and under development. The third item that we updated was participation. We looked at HMIS participation around the projects. Out of, 23,000, 24,000 projects reported each year, there were, I don't know, somewhere around 100 that had mixed HMIS participation. So we decided that we would just update this to be more or less binary, right? You either enter your beds as all HMIS participating or not, and if you are in one of those mixed projects, you're going to need to create a separate project for your portion that is not in HMIS. So we, again, found that the impacts of this change should be light, but it actually has repercussions in your AHAR, in our AHAR analysis that will coincide with the LSA piece. So for ease later down the road, we thought we would make this update now. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so this is another thing that actually has implications within the larger AHAR context because of your regionality, whether you're designated as rural, suburban, or urban. So we're requiring that all projects have an HMIS project ID. Historically, it was only those who uploaded their HIC from HMIS, but we would like everyone to have the project ID. Again, it's largely tied to that idea of can we figure out which projects are in what type of geographic areas. So that's kind of the core purpose. Hopefully you will be able to use that similar type of analysis as well. We're using it for ourselves, but there is something to be said about within your COC, what is your composition? What's your geographic layout between urban, suburban, and rural, and how do things flow? Many COCs have a little bit of everything. So, all right, the next two are things we're getting rid of. So number 5, we had discussions with the VA, and they asked us if we could remove the VA-funded compensated work therapy transitional residence program. It really is a residential treatment program. This is another one where we looked at the impacts in the larger point-in-time count and the HIC, not that many projects or beds overall. So we were okay with that. So if you are one of those few COCs that do have these compensated work therapy transitional residence beds or projects, you will not include that in the HIC this year. And obviously, we won't include persons from those beds in the point-in-time count either. We got rid of target population A as well. It has been optional for several years, and it's one of those things that's also not in HMIS, and so it actually ends up becoming a pain for those who use HMIS largely to generate their HIC. So hopefully this is just one less thing you have to worry about. What was target population B still exists, which looks at HIV-targeted housing and shelters or housing targeted towards those survivors of domestic violence. So those will remain on, and we'll just call that target population. All right, next slide, please. All right, another area, this is more of a clarification. It's not really an update, but we had lots of AAQs around housing type and trying to figure out what is the right designation, and then it got a lot more confusing when you threw on emergency shelter with the bed type. So without saying all the words that are on the slide you have in front of you, I just want to refer you to the table. So you really, as a project, need to select. You are either site-based single site, site-based clustered multiple site, or tenant-based scattered site. If you are currently in a place where you have multiple designation or housing types, you'll need to enter those separately. So that's another one. This is one where we think once some of the clarification happens, it will help, like this table hopefully is helpful, especially for those with emergency shelter. But we'll watch closely as we get comments and questions through the AAQ or through today's office hours. Next slide, please. All right, this actually is kind of a corollary to the last one where we're looking at sponsor-based rental assistance projects, and folks had lots of questions again on the AAQ about the proper designation. Should they be really, if they're operating like tenant-based or project-based, how are we showing them in terms of the housing type classifications? So the reality is sponsor-based could show up in either or. So just make sure if you have a project base or a sponsor base that's really a facility base or a single site, show it as single site and kind of follow the nature of the housing itself. All right, victim service providers, obviously not entering data into HMIS and definitely not entering address information into the HIC. We would encourage use of the zip code for those projects. Again, this ties to both your ability and our ability to figure out where projects lie from a larger geographic principle, right? Are they largely in rural areas? Are they largely in urban areas? So this is more to help us figure out those type of designations, but we certainly want to protect the privacy of our victim service providers and those serving victims of domestic violence. Next slide, please. All right, I've been waiting a long time to be able to say this. There are no changes in the point-in-time count data collection itself. We are keeping the tables the same. Everything is the same for last year's data collection for the point-in-time count. There were a couple of the HIC items I mentioned that have some impact here, right? Like we're not doing the compensated work therapy, so just don't include them. We're for the joint program, you just need to know what's going to show up where. But those, for the PIT count itself, we're not making any changes. And again, we really hope to be able to do that next year. So that's kind of exciting. All right, next slide, please. Okay, we're going to pause there. I want to open up for questions about the 2019 point-in-time count.
So this is the part where if you guys want to verbally ask questions on your phone, you're going to use that little hand feature in the participants panel of your WebEx.
Yeah, and let's address, Aubrey, the first question. It was a HOPWA question that was in the Q&A. So it was essentially a question of a recipient or a COC has HOPWA TBRA, and they're wondering how does it play out in the HIC? Right, because there are actually some questions about how it plays out in the LSA. I'm not going to answer the LSA question, but there's already an AAQ there. So this is a tough one because it does depend on how the beds are used, right? If the beds are designated for homeless, that's the easy scenario. And you say, okay, these beds are dedicated for the homeless. They are definitely to be included on the HIC. If they're definitely not dedicated for the homeless, which is actually more rare for us to see like beds truly not dedicated for the homeless that are HOPWA funded, then you wouldn't include them. But most, I suspect, are in this gray area of they don't necessarily require that folks be homeless, but they're finding that they often serve predominantly a homeless population. So here is what you can do. You actually have two options. You can include the entire inventory, which is similar to what we've said about some other programs, like our ride providers, right? They are in a similar boat where they often don't say one way or the other who's going to be served in them, and there's a question about what you include. Include all of them. So for this, you have the choice of including all of them, or you can look at the use in the project either on that night or over the course of the year, to get a sense of how are the beds or what percents of the beds are typically serving persons who are homeless. This makes sense if you think that the majority are not necessarily going to people who are experiencing homelessness. If you think most of them are, I would suggest just including the whole project. But again, you'll have to take kind of a snapshot from yourself first of do you think most people in the project tend to be homeless. But that gives you a few options.
Great. Tina Moore, I'm going to unmute you to ask your question.
Okay, can you hear me?
I can.
All right, thank you so much. I don't know if this is the right time to ask this. So I'm with Georgia Balance of State Continuum of Care, and when we're entering our rapid rehousing projects onto the housing inventory, you know, in HMIS it's one project, but they're in multiple counties, so we've been entering them and breaking out the counties on the housing inventory so we could get a sense of where those folks were on the night of the count. And doing the LSA, it almost seems like we need to stop doing that. And I guess we want to know HUD's preference. You know, we could enter just one project, one line on the housing inventory, and then just put the zip code they're predominantly in, but it could be a project broken across 6 counties. And so I guess we just aren't sure the best way to enter the data anymore.
Yeah, it's a good question, Tina, and you have a lot of counties that you get to work with. So this is my recommendation. At HUD, we rarely dig very far in the sub-COC levels. We actually do use that data, but not a ton. We use it a lot more when there's a disaster or, well, there are a couple questions that tend to come up. But I think the way you should look at this is what do you gain from it as a COC, right? If it tells you a lot about how your beds are distributed and you use that and it helps you do gaps analysis, that feels like that's very helpful. Or if you plan on doing that, right, you may not be doing that now. If you don't really do that and don't really plan on using the data that way, maybe you use other tools to help you do that, then I would say you could do it as a single project, and that probably reduce some of your data entry time as well. So we're okay with either one. We would just recommend that you look at your own usage.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Thanks, Gina. If you can go ahead and unraise your hands after you've spoken. This is just a general announcement. That'll help me to understand who still has questions. Let's go to Monica. If you still have a question, if you could hit *6 on your phone to unmute yourself. Let's see if that works. Monica? Okay, maybe that didn't work. Let's see. Kevin Nolan, I know you had asked a question or two in the Q&A. Do you still have an additional question? I'm going to unmute you if you do.
I do. Can you hear me?
Great. Yep, I can hear you.
Okay, so I haven't read the notice, so bear with me. It might be answered in there. It appears that we'll be submitting this in the HDX 1.0. Is that correct? And then when will this actually start getting submitted in HDX 2.0? And with that, will all our previous HICS point-in-time information in 1.0 be transitioned into 2.0?
Great question. I will defer to Megan. I think I know the answers, but Megan, you're probably best to answer that.
Yeah, so this year for 2019, we're going to stick for the hit in the pit with HDX 1.0. HDX 2.0 will be ready for the 2020 count, and all of your data will be transferred over to the new site.
Thanks, Megan. I'm going to answer another question that I saw written down, which was from Anthony asking about LGBTQ. We do not have that as a requirement to ask persons experiencing homelessness about their LGBTQ status. There are lots of reasons there. The HIC or the PIT already kind of walks a tough line on questions that are difficult to ask in the middle of the night. That is one where we're nervous about communities doing it without the proper training and without the ability to be sensitive to the nature of the question. So communities can ask that. You're allowed to. HUD's not requiring it. And if you do, that's, again, make sure you're doing it with those who are trained and will be sensitive to how the questions are asked. And we think that could be fantastic, could yield a lot of information for you. But again, we're not asking it largely because it's not required for any of the data collection we do. now, and we want to be sensitive to the realities of the difficulty of asking that often in the middle of the night. Aubrey, other persons with their hands raised?
I think that Megan's got a few that folks have sent through the Q&A.
Okay.
We want to turn to Megan.
So we had two questions around best practices. The first was around what are the best practices around night of count, so during the evening hours versus daytime counts, and how many COCs conduct overnight counts versus counting during the day.
Great questions. So that's a really loaded question, right? The best practices, that's tough because it depends on several things. One is actually one of the topics we have today. It depends on your volunteer base. Those who do the most effective overnight counts have a very heavy volunteer base. So they have a lot of people involved. They have good training. More and more the counts that we're seeing that are using mobile technology, we're finding that's making things easier, right? Middle of the night is tough for so many logistical reasons, and this is one of those things that has helped make that easier in communities I've seen that in. What we find is those who have great success doing it often have street outreach as their kind of leaders. They're the ones who are helping set up the routes. They're the ones who often are leading teams, especially teams that are going to areas that are a little more dangerous. We have seen good use of law enforcement as well in doing that. That depends on your jurisdiction and your relationship with law enforcement. But we've actually seen a lot of good partnerships with law enforcement at late night counts, especially when you're going into encampments. As long as the relationship is okay there, like that tends to be favorable and people are not put off by it usually. So, and when we know law enforcement is going to be involved, sometimes the street outreach teams will go, you know, a couple days in advance to encampments and just kind of give them a heads up, hey, the count's happening soon. We're going to be coming here with possibly with law enforcement as well. You know, this is not, you know, and you kind of reassure them, but at the same time you give them a heads up. So it's a courtesy, but also like it prevents people from being put out if they see policemen in the middle of the night unexpectedly. Those are just a few that I would throw out off the cusp. I would also, I would open it to Megan and Aubrey if you have other practices that you've seen that are really strong.
I think
I would just say that,
William.
Go ahead, Megan.
Go ahead, Aubrey.
I was just going to say, I would just recommend, first of all, if you're doing a daytime count of any form, make sure that you're not asking people about a future night of where they're going to be sleeping. I've seen some COCs do that, and you can't predict the future, so that's a little hard to be asking people where they anticipate they'll be sleeping on, for example, the upcoming night. And then obviously keep in mind that any counts that are conducted during the daytime might possibly miss folks who were in fact sleeping in unsheltered locations on the night designated for the count.
And if you're doing daytime, you have to use an interview. You can't do an observation base.
Yes.
And really, that was a good point with the date. You're supposed to tie to a single day anyways if you do a multi-day count, but we have seen communities asking where people will be sleeping tonight at like 5 in the evening, 6 in the evening. Yeah, don't do that. Ask where they slept last night. So peg your night to a night where people have already slept or in the process of sleeping, right? It's nighttime hours and they're sleeping. So good points, Aubrey. Megan, you want to add?
No, that was perfect.
Cool. Do you guys, Megan or Aubrey, know the numbers? I know most of our communities do late night counts, and actually a lot of them also have like a VA stand-down event or a veteran stand-down event or Project Connect event, or have like service-based counts that they do over the next couple days afterwards, but a lot of them still kind of have an overnight hub or kind of central way that they do things. Does that sound right to you? I'd say it's probably 75% or more of the country do a form of overnight.
I think so, yeah. I think if there is some sort of, exactly as you said, if there's a daytime effort, it's usually done along, in the days that follow the night count.
Great. Let's move to the next question.
Okay, maybe we should do one more question here, and then we'll move on to our focus topic, and then we are coming back to Q&A later in the call, just to remind folks. Let's go ahead and try somebody on the phone. Chessa Dixon, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you.
Can you hear me okay?
Yep, I can hear you.
Okay. So I'm with the Balance of State in Missouri, Region 10 specifically, but our point in time count is held like from 5 to 9 at night, and it's just that day. So last year I wasn't involved a whole lot with the planning and everything for the count, but this year I'm going to be more involved, and I feel like last year it wasn't that accurate because we only did it for those few hours and just for that day. So do you guys have any suggestions or recommendations to help get a more accurate count?
Yeah, great question. So we mentioned a few things already, right? The time, if you're counting at 5, asking about sleeping, you probably should be asking about the night before. I would recommend leveraging your service-based opportunity here, right? Sometimes we think you are doing a whole nother count, or it's extending your count for several days, and many times it does do something like that, but it can be simpler, right? You can just as people access things like food banks or access things like libraries, places where they would commonly go where you're not sure that they would have been counted on the night, you can go ahead and at least ask if they had been included in the count over the next 7 days after your designated pit night. So also using your street outreach folks. So if for whatever reason you can't do more on the night of the count itself, use your post-night opportunities to follow up with folks who you think are likely homeless and ask about where they were on the night of the count. We've seen a lot of folks who have by name lists using by name lists very well that way, right? If they didn't see that somebody was identified on the night of the count, they'll just do a quick follow-up, right? They'll ask them, and they have all their information, so it's not even a very long conversation. It's simply, hey, we were doing our count the other night, we didn't see you, just wanted to see where you were, and you can find out that simply. So I don't know if that helps you a ton, but I'd say that's kind of a lower effort, but still should yield some good benefits for you.
Great. Thanks, William. For those of you who still have some other questions, just a reminder that we will come back to another Q&A portion of this for the last half hour or so of the call. And for anything that we don't get to today, you can always submit an AAQ to the Ask a Question desk, and we'll get to those within a few days. William, are you ready to move on to our focused conversation?
I am.
All right.
All right. We thought it would be helpful now, as opposed to like in January, to talk a little bit about volunteers, some things to think about in terms of recruiting and training. But we realized as we were having conversations, we certainly have lots of thoughts about it, but it would be, I think, more useful to get a sense of what you guys are doing through the polls. So most of this will actually be driven by the poll questions, just to get a sense of what communities around the country are doing around recruitment and training of volunteers. So with that, let's jump to our first poll.
All right, so the first poll is open. I went ahead and put them on slides as well, just in case it's hard to see on your computer screen all of the possible answers. But here's the question, and here are the options. If on any of these your answer is that your community is doing something else that we haven't listed here in our very minimal options of responses, go ahead and send a chat, not just to me, the host, but to everybody, all participants on the call, and kind of share what your COC is doing, because I think there's a lot of innovation that's happening across the country that everyone could learn from. So if there's something that you guys are doing that that you think other people might benefit from learning about? Please share.
Cool, and for volunteers, we've actually seen so many different things across the country. We've seen many people use some volunteers. We've seen a few COCs say, no, we have enough manpower within the COC from between our providers being either required or just kind of knowing this is their what they're going to do, or street outreach, that they've said, no, we don't want volunteers. We do understand volunteers does result in more work, right? Like you have to train them, you have to find them, you have to follow up with them, you have to see if, make sure they come, you have to be prepared for them not to come, right? Like there's all of the contingencies that come with it, but it's also a very, very powerful way, not only for you to expand your reach, but also expand your reach, I guess, beyond just point in time count. It lets you help people get in the shoes of these people that they see every day on the street and just kind of ignore or don't know what to do with. So we love using volunteers, certainly not a mandatory thing though. So let's give you another couple of seconds and then we'll look at the results, see what's going on.
About 10 more seconds. Got 190 some responses. This is pretty good. Well done, guys. All right, can you see the answers?
I can see them. So it looks like a little over half use volunteers, some volunteers in the unsheltered count, and that's, again, typically where we see volunteers. We still have a good portion using about a sixth of the COC saying that they use folks in the sheltered pit count or volunteers in the sheltered count. We tend to see that more in areas where they're not using HMIS as a primary source for uploading the HIC data and the point-in-time, sheltered point-in-time count data, and so that can be really powerful. Service-based, we see about 70 COCs of the 300 do use volunteers in the service-based count. That's interesting to me. I would have thought it might have been a little higher as you have events, but at the same time, we often see that providers are running the event, so maybe that does make sense. So in the data cleanup process, it's great to see folks using volunteers for that. That's sometimes people don't know what to do with it. So, and then we have some kind of not sure or not involved in the count itself. No. So a lot of good stuff there. So we see a good use of volunteers. It's interesting because I've seen as many as over 5,000 volunteers in one COC and then none in other COCs. So you have a big mix. The 5,000 is certainly more unique, but it's not unique to see more than 100. I've seen many COCs where they have more than 100 volunteers, which is impressive, again, for all the logistics involved. So that's great. All right, let's move to the next poll question then.
Okay. This one is about the partners who are involved in your volunteer recruitment. The poll should be open.
Yeah, this is another one where we see kind of a mix of things. We find some COCs designate an agency either because of street outreach or they're tied to the community for other reasons, and just as the recruitment king, right, or queen, and go out and they're the ones who do the majority of the recruitment. We see some use, they'll use like the city actually, right? They'll use the mayor to help, or the mayor's office to go and help bring people out, or they'll use the state, and that's great. So we are always curious about where our volunteers are coming from as well, right? How many of you are using federal partner volunteers, period? So that's it's a slightly different question, but it's also kind of think about where are your volunteers coming from? Lots of different opportunities there. Let's give you another, I don't know, 10 seconds or so, and then we'll look at the results.
And for those of you who are, I'm suspecting that it's not possible for attendees to send messages in the chat to all attendees. So when you send those just to us, I've been sending them out to folks in case you're curious to see what people are putting in for those other categories.
All right, a lot of folks coming from either the COC stakeholders or local nonprofits and social service providers, which is, there's probably a huge overlap there anyways. And then a fairly small showing from the others. Some state partners, some federal partners, but mainly from COC and local nonprofits. Not too surprising there. I did want to highlight a few that we had seen in the chat. We see folks using elected officials in college. College students is a really good one. We see great partnerships between COCs and universities, even if there's not other interactions throughout the years, right? Like nursing schools. We see a lot of nursing schools involved, or social work schools, where a professor is willing to give extra credit for a student that goes to participate in the PIT count. That is fantastic and has an amazing ability to bring people out. So if you have a university around you or a college, please use it as a resource that can be really, really powerful. And you'll bring in peers, which is helpful because especially as we do make sure we're sensitive to youth experiencing homelessness. When you're able to bring in 18 to 24-year-olds, it's a nice way to interact with them, with their peers. So that's great. All right. So that's a little bit about where our folks are coming from, our volunteers. Let's go to the next poll then.
So this one has 2 questions that were just released at once. So make sure you scroll down in your polling tab to hit both of those.
This is one where I admit I know less about, but I've seen smatterings of things in COCs. So that first question, what requirements exist, right? I've seen some COCs have age requirements, some don't. We see that some COCs require their service providers to have volunteers and some don't. We require some, have to have teams that require at least one person in the team must something, right? Have, a social worker or some other qualification to help them engage. So this is more of my selfish desire to figure out what type of requirements you guys are having. And that second question, we do actually see quite often liability waivers, right? We're all a little sensitive to the reality that any volunteers is positive, but also has some liability associated with it. And so we've seen communities protect themselves by doing liability waivers. I will say, as we were releasing the point-in-time count guide that we released in 2014, we had debated about whether we would put out a sample form, and we struggled to get it passed through our lawyers just because it has our own liabilities. So kind of highlighted the reality that there are liabilities all the time. So this is a type of thing where I would encourage communities, if you feel like you have a good waiver, if you'd be willing to share with other partners, other COCs, that would be fantastic. We certainly encourage that. I wish we had a little more flexibility to share some of our own ideas on it. We just didn't get past that hurdle. So let's give a few more seconds and then let's see what the results are. All right. So it looks like the age requirement is fairly common. About a third of the COCs on the call said that they have some form of age requirement. And then not a whole lot for the others. So there's a chunk that said no requirements at all. A few have volunteer, service provider requirements, and a few have professional qualification requirements, but not a whole lot there. So The liability forms, also not seeing as much as I would have thought. About 73 out of the 350 or so said that they have waivers. So that's interesting, not as many as I thought. And that might be because there's no standard waiver form. So if you're a COC that has that and you're willing to share, please do so.
Hey, William, where do you want people to share those examples? I've got a bunch of people messaging me in the chat saying they would be happy to share theirs or that they're interested in seeing examples from other places.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think share, and then I don't have a place. Because we can't post it. Are we able, Aubrey, to put any resources up in this session? Utilize?
I don't think so.
So if you're willing to share and you don't mind putting your email out there, that would be great. I know I'm kind of asking a lot there because some folks don't really want to do that. But if so, please post it there so that folks can come to you. That's something
people can also. We could also ask people to put it through the AAQ if that's something they're interested in. That can be a way to aggregate contact info.
Oh, that's a good idea. Yeah, our one catch is, again, because we can't even create our own form, we can't post communities forms, so we have some funny limitations around us signing off on them and the appearance of signing off. So any way we can share kind of through each other, that's ideal. But we'll explore what we can through the AAQ as well. That's a good idea, Aubrey.
Okay.
But if you're willing to put your email out and you have one that you're willing to share, thank you. Really appreciate that.
I think folks have my email address from this webinar registration as well. So I'm seeing a couple people saying that they will email them to me, which is fine. Okay. So next question?
Yep, let's go to the next question.
Okay.
All right. So for those who use volunteers, and look like a lot do, how do you train them? Right? We just put a couple of options that seemed, that we often see. There certainly may be others, but we threw out a couple, right? The online, live, online, pre-recorded, in-person, prior to the night of the count, right, in the next days or weeks leading up to it, and then you have the, show up early to the count, but on the night of the count, you'll get your training. Just by way of comment on some of those. So your community kind of has to figure out what has worked and what you think might work. We have some communities that have said, look, we wanted to do training ahead of time, but it was impossible, right? We just could not get our volunteers out to do that. Whereas we've had some say that actually is a positive way of finding out the commitment of the volunteers, right? They've used it as a volunteer reinforcement piece and kind of feel comfortable that if they come to the training, they're probably going to come to the count too, which is also kind of a clever strategy of figuring out what your true volunteer base is going to be when it comes down to it. And then the online is great. We've seen more and more online. You have a little less knowledge about how present they are for the training. So that's something that kind of always exists, and I think it's a calculated risk. We have seen some communities that have an online requirement, and then they'll make sure on the night of the count, they'll do like a 10-minute refresher on the most important things. And sometimes they do it informally, right? Like, hey guys, we see you, we're getting ready to go. Remember, blah, 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 and then they make sure they hit those top things. So that's another way to approach, which is pretty effective. Let's give it another 2 or 3 seconds, and we'll close up the poll, and let's see what the results are.
So in the chat, I'm having to multitask too much, so I haven't been pasting as many things to everybody. But I'll go ahead and just comment that one COC has the unsheltered survey emailed out to volunteers so that they can review it before the count. And then some folks are saying that they would really like to see a good training example for volunteers.
That's very convenient, because one of the things we wanted to put out for you guys is a slide deck that you could use, right? It would just be an open PowerPoint presentation that would cover some core issues around the PIT count. And so we've intended to do that for a while. It actually has been moving along. So we'll make that available to you, and you guys can do what you want with it. You can take whatever slides you want and ignore whatever you want. But we kind of have heard loud and clear it'd be nice to have some stock slides so you don't have to reinvent the wheel every year, but also the ability to manipulate them for your own needs. So let's take a quick peek at the results. It looks like most people do in-person trainings prior to the count. Looks like almost half, not quite half, but certainly more than a third do in-person prior to the count. We are seeing the online options being used, a little over 10% for each of those, which is great. We'll probably see more of that in the future. And then we see a fair chunk, about 60 COCs who do training on the night of. So not a ton, but definitely have some of that happening there. So lots of good training opportunities happening there. I did see someone mention in the chat that they use the training, or they use kind of their composition of the PIT count teams themselves almost as a way of reinforcing training. I've seen that in a lot of communities where they'll make sure a street outreach person is involved or a COC partner who is, you know, in the work, right, a service provider, that their staff is on every team. So that's a great way to do it, because then your volunteers, if they're a little nervous, they can see someone else lead the way. We actually, if they're not so nervous, or at least they're willing to count, we would encourage you, let them do the work on it. It's great for them to get the experience of engaging persons experiencing homelessness, recognize they're like real people, people who have needs, but love human interaction often, and so or are willing to interact with folks. I love the opportunities involved in the PIT count, because it really gives a lot for people who volunteer and get the public involved. All right, let's move to the next question. We just have 2 more poll questions. So this one is about how you're engaging the larger public. So what are you doing to help folks in the community understand what's going on, or that the PIT count is happening? And obviously you see a bunch of options, social media, we have our PIT count posters, which we're actually gearing up to send out to you. Your own PIT count posters, and then various other forms of media. We love to see it published. This actually raises another issue we see that we may have as part of a larger discussion, but it's what is your framing of the count? We're kind of have always been sensitive to the reality that people don't necessarily want to be called homeless. This became very obvious with our youth, right? They don't want to be part of a homeless count, but they may be less reticent to participate in just a survey or a survey about housing. So the framing about whether it's a homeless survey or not is something to certainly consider, and is a really important factor. So if you can avoid calling it the homeless count, that probably is best. But finding a way that everyone knows what it is, and yet not quite so intimidating for those who don't want to identify as homeless, then that's something we recommend. So we'll give you another 5-10 seconds, and we'll see what's going on with the survey.
And one thing to comment too, William, is that the posters and the social media files have actually been posted to HUD Exchange already. If folks want to try to access those, they were in one of the HUD Exchange listserv announcements about this session. So the printed ones are in the process of being printed and disseminated nationwide, but those other things are available online if you want a Facebook or Twitter catered photo.
Great call. And we do it both in English and in Spanish. We didn't go further than that in languages, but we certainly recognize that those are 2 really necessary ones. So, but certainly you may need to adapt for other languages as needs be. All right, so let's look at what's going on. How do we inform the public? You get about a third of folks saying using their social media. and a good smattering of use of some form of poster, whether it's HUD's poster or your own local poster, and then some use of newspaper and radio. Certainly a lot of publishing via website, and some use of newsletters. So it seems like the most popular social media. We're really happy to see that. That's great. We find that phones in particular, most people have phones, regardless of where you are. So that's awesome. All right.
William, there's one person who commented in the chat that they actually don't advertise the pit count anymore due to past experience of police officers conducting sweeps immediately before the count.
Oh, well, that's a good call. We unfortunately have seen that a little bit. We've seen less of it of late, but yeah, you'll have to figure out what the impact is on your law enforcement. We hope that they're good partners, but we've seen this unfortunate experience where they use the pit count for their own purposes. So yes, if that's happening in your community, certainly don't advertise it to avoid that issue.
Mm-hmm.
Other ones on the chat, Aubrey, that I might have missed?
There's one person who said that they visit 24-hour businesses in the county to alert them that it's going to be happening and to ask them to help. But it didn't necessarily help to locate additional people experiencing homelessness. But that effort is still an important one.
That's a great point. It's funny because one of the potential discussion points that we had talked about in preparing for this was, did we talk about engagement with private institutions? We know some COCs have a fairly straight line of no, and others kind of have mixed yes, maybe. That has all sorts of ramifications, and we may do that as one of our topics in the future of our discussions of pit counts. Or in our office hours, because it's really important, but also, again, it's important to understand the layers before you walk too far into that one.
Great.
All right, can we move to the last poll then?
All right, poll's open.
All right, well, we love to have volunteers, and everybody loves to be appreciated, especially when they sacrifice sleep or early morning hours or late night hours. So we hope that that you guys are doing some sort of follow-up with volunteers. We've seen some very simple follow-ups, right? Just simple emails of thank you, and then some more elaborate ones like volunteer appreciation dinners and things like that. So just curious what you guys are doing with your volunteer follow-up. We certainly encourage you to do some sort of follow-up. If nothing else, send them the results of the count. Let them see that they did something that is measurable and help them connect to people. It's often actually very powerful to send information about people who are served, right, an anecdote or a story along with the numbers, just to kind of reinforce the, like, this means something, right? These are real people. You're counting, so there are numbers, but there's somebody behind each of these numbers, and we want you to relate to them. So something like that is always great. So we're going to close out in the next couple seconds on the poll and see what's going on.
I will say while the poll is closing, we've gotten a few questions about things like when the point-in-time count model surveys will be posted. Those remain posted at all times. We'll do a quick review of them sometime in the next few weeks just to make sure that we didn't miss anything for the updates to the pit count notice last year, but since there were no changes to the notice this year, they should be updated and ready to go in terms of making sure that they include all of the data elements that are required to be reported to HUD.
Great points. All right. So we're seeing less kind of responses on the follow-up side. So hopefully that's something, maybe if you hadn't done it before, it's something to consider. We see a small grouping, less than 10%, host some sort of volunteer appreciation, which again usually isn't tied to the pit count exclusively. It's tied to a larger volunteer appreciation. certainly seeing some thank you notes that go out. That's great. Nearly 20% of folks do some sort of thank you notes. And then sending results to volunteers. We see, looks like also a little less than 20% are also doing that. And then some other ideas here. So let's peek in the chat. Anything pop out? So, a certificate of appreciation. That's a great idea. So I like that a lot. Anything else? Aubrey, anything I'm missing on other ways that folks are following up?
A lot of folks are linking this to the follow-up they do with volunteers on how the process unfolds, which I think was not quite the intention of this question, but is also an important piece to get at. It sounds like a lot of people have taken the opportunity to follow up with volunteers to understand what they can improve about either their training process or about how they recommend to folks to conduct the pit count to make sure that they're constantly learning from past experience and improving as they go.
Yeah, great points. All right, you've heard way too much from me already, so let's actually open up to questions and answers.
Great. Let's go ahead and start with, let's see, Natasha Googe. I'm going to go ahead and unmute you.
Isn't it interesting because not because he won't.
Natasha, can you hear me?
Hi there, yes.
Hi.
Okay, so a good time to ask my question?
Yeah.
Yep, can you speak a little closer to the phone now where you can hardly hear you?
Okay, well, I don't know where the speaker is on this thing, but I can speak up.
Okay.
I'm interested in folks that are arrested like the night before the count and held in jail. You know, they're homeless for weeks or months or even longer before and likely to be after. Can we count those people?
Great question. So the guidance on that is specifically no, you can't count them for the night of the point in time count, which is, again, it's a tough one because the very next day they could very well be homeless. So it's one of those things where the point in time count is very specific as to what's counted. It's tied to statute. And so those who are residing in prisons, jails, other institutions cannot be counted, again, by statute. So what I would say is, don't include them in what you submit to HUD. If you have the resources to find out about that population during the pit count, I think that's fantastic. There are many communities that do that, and it will give you a better sense of what's going on with your community. So if you do a community report that's not submitted to HUD, I would include that data, similar to what you might do with your education data, right? Include what your liaisons say about how many children and youth who are in schools are homeless on the night of the count, even though it has doubled up folks and it has different information. So we encourage, get as much information as you can, even if you can't report it to HUD. Good question.
Great. Let's go ahead and turn to Megan. I think has a few that have been aggregated from the Q&A and the chat. Megan?
Sure. So we had a few questions come in around mobile apps. How do you use, develop, or access mobile apps for the pit count?
All right. That was actually another one of those where we'll probably have a whole discussion about technology in an office hour. Apps are certainly at kind of the forefront of that, but there are other things like how do you folks use helicopters and drones and other things. For mobile apps, there's a couple things to think about, right? We did a webinar last Monday, October 22nd, on using ArcGIS. Most counties, actually I think nearly every county in the country has a subscription to ArcGIS, and you often may not know who that is. So we have a person from Esri who's the product owner of ArcGIS. They will help you find out who that is in your organization, or at least what office in your organization has it. I mention that specifically because one of the tools available is a mobile point-in-time count app called Survey 123. So that could more or less be free to you if you find out the right person to talk to access that. That's not available necessarily to everyone, maybe because the county is already using all of their subscription and doesn't want to move away and kind of include the app. So you can look at vendors. There are private vendors that do the point-in-time count app. And there are a couple different options. So I actually am not really allowed to to kind of sell vendors. I mentioned Esri specifically in this case because it already is more or less free to communities, and it's something that's already developed that way. But if you're going to go and hire a vendor, I can't really recommend anybody. But there are plenty of them out there, and there are communities using them. So this is another ask for those who wouldn't mind sharing. If you are using a mobile app and you're willing to let people know that and share your email, if you want to do that, or even if folks want to share different apps, right? If so, so that different communities can kind of see the different apps that are available. Did that answer the question, Megan? All of the question?
I think so.
Okay.
Great. So folks who might be working for COCs who are willing to share their email addresses, if you could just send me a message in the chat with your COC and your email address, I can, if you're comfortable with that, I can send that out to all the people on the call so that if there are folks who are interested in learning more from your experience, they can reach out directly to you. Okay, let's take a look at Melissa McWhinney. I'm going to unmute you and you can ask a question. Melissa? Melissa, are you there? Melissa, you are unmuted if you want to say something. Okay, didn't seem to work. Let's go to Melissa. Is it Mikel or Michael?
Yes, it's Michael.
Hi, Melissa.
Hi, I thought you were calling on me first. So I have two questions in relation to the HIC. The first one would be, I know it's been addressed previously, but are the number of beds reported on the HIC tied to what's reported for on the Project COC application? So for example, something like our Shelter Plus Care, if they say they have 50 VASH vouchers, and on their application they say they have 100 beds, but on the night of the point in time count, because of the household composition, it's different. There may be less or more. You know, maybe they're serving single individuals rather than households with children. Is that going to count against that project during application time?
Good question. So I have to be careful. I'm certainly not allowed to speak to the NOFA, especially since for our purposes we haven't awarded. I will say though, and I think I can safely say that we treat them separate. The project application is separate from the HIC for the very reasons you mentioned. Ideally though, your screen 4B, which is your housing and services screen in the project application where you report your beds and units, should have some semblance, right? Should be somewhat close to the HIC, but again, we have not used a comparison because of known timing issues there.
Got it. Got it. Okay. And then I had one more regarding VASH, and it was in the same context of the HOPWA question that you answered. If we know that not all the VASH vouchers are being used for literally homeless, do we still include all those VASH vouchers on our HIC?
Yes, and that's a little scarier because they actually really should be homeless.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, that I know. I just want to.
yeah. So yes, because that one really is a requirement, yes, you should include those beds.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you.
Yep.
Okay. For people who are asking questions about the specific apps and stuff, if you could go ahead and just direct those to the people who have given their email addresses. People are asking what HMIS system they use, what app they use, all of those kinds of details. If they volunteered their email, I'm willing to bet they'll be able to answer those questions if you contact them. Let's see. So we don't have anybody else with raised hands. If you do have a question that you would like to ask out loud, make sure you use that raise hand button in the participants panel. But I'll turn to Megan now and see if there's anything else that's come through the chat or the Q&A.
Sure. We had a couple of questions come in around observation-based counts and specifically the observation tool that we mentioned earlier. One question was essentially, what are some of the ways that communities are collecting information on refusals or just observation-based counts? And another came in around how to utilize that tool effectively, and whether it can be used for other purposes like language barrier issues or refusals. I think that's just generally what the best practices are around both using the observation-based tool and conducting an observational count.
Yeah, great question. We love to see people using the observation tool. We still continue to hear some COCs, if they can say that they identified someone but have no information on them, they're still throwing away the record, which there are some mixed feelings about that one, partly because, yes, you want good data, but if you know you're confident it is tied to a person, please at least extrapolate to account for that person. You can throw the record out, but recognize there's a person there, and you need to make sure they're included in your count. What we've seen more and more is communities are doing, focusing more on an interview base, but having the observation-based survey available. And this is, again, one of those things where the mobile app is extremely helpful, because maybe there's someone who you don't want to wake up, or you think it's an unsafe situation, but you see the person and you want to take note of them, and they switch, instead of doing an interview-based, they'll do the observation-based so that that person is accounted for. And all the COCs, you guys can decide what rules you have around that. Usually the basic rules are you're sure that this person is not someone at least you have identified otherwise, and if it's the middle of the night, right, that's a pretty confident deduplication piece, but also note the location. So some many apps now, you can literally pin the location. Otherwise, you can create a location that makes sense to you. Obviously, sometimes you don't have cross streets. You may be in the woods. It may be somewhere. Find something that makes sense to you. And this is one where you may want to have, your street outreach team who may be with you, or your more experts from the COC kind of figure out how to name locations, but something to think about there. Whether or not you should use it for other barriers is a bit of a challenge, because if you can collect some information on them, using an interview-based tool is often probably better. If for no other reason, you can use the extrapolation tool that we put out, which is more to help extrapolate for demographics and some of the the questions that are within the survey. So I would kind of push you more towards using the interview-based with and having no, you may have some blank responses or some didn't answer responses. I'm actually curious if Aubrey or Megan want to weigh in too.
I think Megan might be having a couple of technical difficulties, so I don't know if she's on the phone right now, but I would say that one of the main questions we get about the observation-based tool is what to do with the data after it's been collected. In terms of if you've got volunteers who are going out and they are making notes about people, and some of the categories are not necessarily things that are readily identifiable as, oh yes, this person should be included, or oh no, this person should definitely not be included, like how to make those determinations given the information that volunteers bring you. And I think one of the biggest pieces that I always recommend when people submit AAQs about this is making sure that you're training your volunteers to include as many details as possible that would lead them to either think that the person might be experiencing homelessness versus not. So for example, if it's 2 in the morning and somebody is sleeping on a park bench, that's a pretty obvious instance of this person should probably be counted as experiencing homelessness. But if it's more ambiguous, like, well, this person was sitting outside of a bench at a 24-hour grocery store, or on a bench outside of a 24-hour grocery store, then instructing them to include as many details as possible that might lead them to believe, oh, they're a worker who's on a smoke break, versus, oh, they're a person who actually doesn't have a safe and stable place to sleep tonight. I think those pieces are key to being able to use the data collected with observation-based tools.
Great point.
Yeah, and I would add, sorry, I am experiencing difficulties, but I'll be back on. It's always, I think, William, you mentioned this as well, but it's always, if you're going to use this tool, if you want to use this tool, it's always best to use it with some other approach, like whether if your CAOC uses outreach teams who are familiar with the population, that can be really helpful and kind of eliminate some of the guesswork. It's always helpful to use it in sort of conjunction with other approaches.
And the reality is you're probably going to have to use discretion as a COC, right? There will definitely be some entries where you're like, well, I just don't know. And you're going to have to take the information you have and make a decision. And that's one of those things where it's just part of the count. And we recognize that that's part of the count, right? This is part of the reality of the PIT count is it's a blunt instrument. It's not perfect. We're not going to know every person who's homeless under the night of the count. But it is a pretty strong way of us understanding how many people are out there. So use your discretion based on the information you have.
Just a reminder to folks that you can still use that hand-raising feature if you want to voice your questions. As much as Megan and William and I love hearing our own voices, we also really would love to hear yours. One of the questions that we've had a few times in the chat and the Q&A is about volunteer recruitment. So we touched on this a little bit, but people want to know, what are the best ways to recruit volunteers? William, do you have anything you want to say to that, or do you want to encourage folks to say stuff in the chat and I can voice those out loud once you send them to me too?
I definitely encourage that because I love hearing from the communities. Some of the things I've seen using a mix of signing up via a website, right? So the more easy and accessible it is to sign up, the better. Using that in conjunction with listservs, especially, right, almost all your service organizations already have their own volunteer base or are using some sort of mailing, email, listserv, and, they interact with folks. So we find that that's fantastic. One that I see a lot in rural communities, but I believe it happens as well in many urban communities, is using your faith base. Faith-based partners can be pretty strong, but one of the ways that they're very strong is through kind of taking advantage of volunteer opportunities, as well as schools. So this is where you have to think about your age limit, but high schools often require their students to have a certain amount of volunteer hours, or at least in the state I am, that's required. So if you have an age limit that is within the high school age range, maybe you have 14 or older or 16 and older, you could actually work with your schools to do some recruitment. Using the VA as well, VA can be a really good partner. We've seen them a good partner in many communities. So using that as a way to recruit is fantastic. And then finally, use your own people who are experiencing homelessness. They are good volunteers, and they can help you understand more about what's going on. So I just encourage you using them in the process as much as possible, and it's even better if you're able to compensate them. Many of you are on no budget for the PIT count, and we don't provide money other than the planning dollars, which we're happy we at least have that. But it's something to think about. It helps them feel more engaged and appreciated and gives them some income, so something to consider. Is there anything we saw in the chat that should be lifted up there, Aubrey?
Yeah, people talked about AmeriCorps Vistas, so AmeriCorps volunteers, or I think they used to be called Vista volunteers. Maybe they're now called AmeriCorps Vistas. I get confused. And then going to colleges, we talked earlier about social work students. I know when I was in social work school, our school always advertised the count in that county to try to recruit people to help out. And then posting in local newspaper listservs or newsletters that go from the COC. Local businesses. One person said that Kohl's provided volunteers, and if they did volunteer for the PIT count or for a certain number of hours, I guess in total, they would get $500. So if they're local businesses, you can partner with to incentivize their employees to participate in these kinds of community activities. So much innovation.
Cool. Let's move to the next question. We are coming close to the hour, so I want to make sure we can answer as much as possible.
Yeah. Megan, do you have any lined up?
I don't. I do have, so William, one of the respondents put together a Google Doc that we might be able to use to collect some of these materials. I don't know if there are issues on your end with distributing that after the call, but it might be a good way to sort of push this into the community rather than have it be organized on our end.
I will see what I can do there.
Okay.
I can't promise, but I love the idea. I think that's a good way to go.
There are so one person, or there have been a few questions about what to do with folks who are working with a rapid rehousing case manager, but who are literally sleeping on the street on the night of the count. You always count people based on where they are sleeping on the night designated for the count. So even if they have been accepted into a rapid rehousing program but have not yet been housed, then you count where they are actually sleeping that night. And then there were a couple people, William, who asked for us to go back to the change to the HIC, to the housing type table. So I don't know if there are specific questions in regards to what folks want to hear more about this, but maybe if you can just touch on that real quick again, William. I pulled that slide back up too if folks want to look at it. And all of this is in the first few pages of the PIT and HIC data collection notice.
Yeah, it may actually make sense. Megan, are you comfortable explaining? You may be able to explain it better than I did. I actually just ran over it. Does that sound good to you? I don't mind actually going over it, but.
Sure. I'm unfortunately not able to see what we're looking at, but I think what we're talking about is the housing type designation.
Yes.
And I think, again, this is really much more of a clarification than a change. And we got a lot of questions last year when we were doing the data cleaning around the HIC on what counted as site-based single site, site-based clustered, and tenant-based scattered. And as I recall, it had a lot to do with those SDRA beds. And so what this does isn't change anything at all. It just clarifies for everybody how we're going to designate the beds on the HIC. So again, site-based single site, those are fairly simple. Those are a single project facility-based beds. Then there are site-based clustered, where there could be a single site, there could be multiple sites. This could include project-based rental assistance that has multiple sites or site-based. And it's sort of that situation where you might consider those beds to be facility-based, but they're not in a single place. And then the tenant-based is sort of what you would imagine tenant-based beds to be. So again, this is really much more of a clarification than a change. But because of the amount of questions coming through the AAQ and the questions that came up during data cleaning, we just figured that this was a good time to make sure everybody had better guidance on this.
So, Megan, people are also asking how these should be configured in HMIS. They're asking if each housing type should be its own project in HMIS, or how that works for projects where maybe they have multiple housing types available.
Yeah, that's a good question. I would need to follow up about that. I don't think they need to be distinct projects in HMIS, but it gets tricky because they do if they're distinct project types on the HIC. So we can certainly draft a response to that question and send it out with all of the other responses that we're going to send out with the other questions.
And I think that partially answers it, right? It depends how heavily you use HMIS to generate the HIC. If you don't, it is not a requirement that you do it. It is an option that you do it. But on the HIC, you do actually need to separate them. And I think Megan for doing that, for describing it, I think the biggest confusion point that folks have is that one in the middle, the site-based clustered multiple sites, which is the idea that you have a project where there's 3 locations, but it really is under, right, like a single sponsor or, right, it's 3 literal locations. So it would be site-based, except that it's not in one spot. Whereas tenant-based, you don't have 3 facilities where the only options of folks seeking services is to go to one of those 3 facilities. Tenant-based is they can go anywhere in the community to access their housing. So if you have that kind of model, that should be separated from a site-based model, any kind of site-based, where really their options are limited to a specific set of houses, not the market itself. I don't know if that helps, but I think that's probably the confusing one, is that middle one.
Yeah, and in general, I would say that, you know, the HIC is finer in terms of how these beds are reported than HMIS in a lot of places. So, for example, it might be that in HMIS it's a single project, and on the HIC it will be 2 distinct projects or some other composition, but then you could have the same HMIS ID associated with those distinct rows. Which I think there was another question, and I again apologize because I can't see them, but there's another question around HMIS ID on the HIC, and I think the question was whether there'll be a place to report that on the HIC or whether the HIC will be updated, and it will. So come 2019, when those data will be submitted onto HDX 1.0, there will be a place for you to input your HMIS ID. I just want to answer that question while we were on the topic.
Okay. Do we have time for one more question, Aubrey?
Yes, we probably do. It's 2:58. Real quick, though, there have been people who are saying, oh, you skipped our question, you skipped our question. If you asked a super specific question, please submit an AAQ. We got over 70 questions during this session. We did not get to all of them, and we're sorry, but unfortunately we only had an hour and a half. Additionally, I'm going to put a link in the chat right now for a follow-up survey that I'm hoping folks will take the time to do. You'll also get an email about it, but it will help to kind of let us understand what your current practices are and to guide our work on the PIT and HIC moving forward. So the last question that we're going to ask on this session today is about rapid rehousing beds and how those are supposed to be counted on the HIC. We've had some people say that they are confused by it every year and would like to hear some guidance.
The rapid rehousing beds, talk about a fun one.
Very quick answer.
It's actually the easiest one to do because it depends, you look literally at the vouchers that are out on the night of the count. So for all persons who are receiving rapid rehousing and have a move-in date, you'll count them in the HIC. And if they don't have a move-in date, you won't count them in the rapid rehousing. You could count them in wherever else they are, right? If they're in transitional housing, you'll count them there, or other facilities that you would otherwise count, you'll count them in those facilities. I'm going to sneak in one more because it's about exceptions. And it was Tim Gilmore's question about if you do an event on February 2nd, does that fall outside of the 10 days of January? And the answer is yes. The way really to think about it is what is the date that you're tying all of your survey questions to. So if you do the event on February 2nd, but you ask everybody if they were asleep on the night of January 29th, you don't need an exception because your PIT count night is January 29th, even if your event is on the 2nd. So think about what day your event or you're pegging everything to. So remember that too, though. If you're doing an event, you should be consistent with everyone else in terms of what night you're looking at for the purposes of counting people as homeless for the PIT count. Okay. With that, thank you all very much. I want to thank APT for making this all happen as well and making sure we get you your resources. But you guys are great. We really appreciate all of your work in the community level and look forward to doing this at least once more before the 2019 count. Thank you all very much.
Great.
Thank you, guys.